We're going to do two things today. The first is go over a little bit about what we call Army writing style as it applies to this course. And that will mean dissecting a little bit about what we mean when we say Army writing style and what makes for good Army writing. Second thing we're going to do is talk about a little bit more of a specific communication skill set that's useful for CI. And that's the ability to structure a short and terse argument. So we'll talk a little bit about the different parts of an argument and then how to actually present one. So let's start with the first of these two and talk a little bit about Army writing style. As I've already modeled before, and I heard a few people laughing about it because I'm sure you've seen this, I put our famous KWLs up there. What we know, what we want to learn, and what we want to learn in the presentation. So let me just ask here, if I said something along the idea of, what makes for good Army writing, what are some features of good Army writing that you know of already? Okay, I see a couple of hands in the back.
Using active voice.
Okay, so the gentleman said using active voice. I think that's a solid one. I'm going to go ahead and put that one up here. All right, others over here.
Being short, concise, and to the point.
All right, being short, concise, and to the point. All right, so I'm going to write in here concise and to the point. Other features of good Army writing. Over here.
It avoids jargon.
Avoids jargon. Okay. And just to unpack that one a little bit, jargon is sort of a loaded term because we are in an acronym-rich environment. So if you could just elaborate a little bit, what do you mean when you say avoids jargon? Because is there some situations when you should use it or others where you shouldn't?
Yes, if it's avoid unfamiliar jargon, I guess is better.
Okay, I like that distinction. For the rest of the room, in case you didn't hear, he said avoid unfamiliar jargon. And that unpacks a whole other area about being really aware of who your audience is. I think it's another good feature. Other techniques of good Army writing? Over here?
Uses common knowledge vocabulary, so simplistic words.
Okay.
So everybody can understand.
Common knowledge vocabulary and simple words. I like that last part too, so I'll just write simple words. Over here.
Structured in a way that any audience can go through it in a single rapid reader.
Okay, structured for single rapid reader. Reading. Single rapid reading. All right, I'm just going to write that as structured. Yeah, I like the way you define that too. Structured for a simple, rapid reading. In other words, identifying the main points and being able to maintain them throughout the course of the document. Going for a repeat. Yep.
And bottom line up front.
Bottom line up front. Our famous bluff. I think that one comes up quite a bit. And when you say the bottom line up front, that's sort of going back to what we mentioned before about the jargon. Can you unpack that term for us a little bit?
Absolutely. That would be the main point or the main idea of the writing.
Okay, so the main idea. If I'm looking at the document from start to finish, whether it be 1 page or 10 pages, it should be the guiding idea, the guiding principle, the big takeaway. And I think that's an important concept to hold on to. It shows up a lot in the military writing. We want to make sure we know about it here. Any others? Over here?
Expanding on the jargon one, if you are going to use an acronym, an uncommon acronym, expand upon it the first time you introduce it into the document.
Okay, so very specifically you said if you are going to use an acronym, make sure to introduce it to your audience. And this kind of goes back to what the gentleman was saying over here. If you're speaking to somebody and they may not know what you're talking about, that you take the part of a good writer and sort of unpack it for them. So I'm going to write out acronyms. Write out the acronyms and to be sure that you're explaining it to an audience. All right, so this is what we already know about good writing. And if we were just going to kind of summarize it all, we said that features of good Army writing include, but are not limited to, active voice, being concise, avoiding jargon, or being more familiar with your audience enough that you use familiar terms to them in simple, clear language, that you write out any unfamiliar terms, especially acronyms, that you use simple word choice and you structure it in such a way as that they can finish it in a single rapid read. Doing good so far? All right, now you guys are all in the context of a CI course, which means you're in the middle of everything that you've already learned and the things that you're about to learn. So I want to know, if you were thinking about how does Army writing style apply to what I'm doing here, what are some things you would like to know about that, about what Army writing style might apply to in here? Over here.
Why do you have like a 30-word limit on sentences?
Good question.
Why is the 30 decided number?
Why a 30-word limit? All right, so the question was, why is there a limit to only 30 words in a sentence? I imagine you mean in a sentence, right, not the paragraph. Okay, so why 30 words in a sentence? Other questions? Over here.
How do you pack potentially complex ideas into very simple sentence structures?
Okay, how do you pack big ideas in small words? Words or sentences? Is that fair? Yeah, and that's a huge concept. You know, in some cases you're going to be working with large abstract concepts. I know in some cases parts of this course touch on human psychology, behavioral analysis, analysis of environments in space, and sometimes this can be very difficult to capture in words. So it's a very solid question. Other things that you think you'd like to learn in terms of how writing style for the Army might apply to this course? Over here.
Since we're going to be working in joint environments or environments with different services, how are we going to mesh those in both in this course and then later on in the field?
Okay, so the question was, how do we mesh the expectations from here into the expectations you'll have in a joint environment? Okay. All right, that's also another really solid question. All right, any other interesting points about writing that you want to learn? And now let's make it less heady and conceptual and even get down to the nitty-gritty. Any question that you would have about writing that you would hope to get addressed before you leave here, whether that's what is the Oxford comma, all the way up to, you know, some of the questions you already asked, like, you know, 30-word limit and so on. Any broad questions about writing? Over here.
What are the specific rules for formatting for counterintel reports?
That's a really good question. So what are the rules for formatting? And I'm just going to abbreviate CI for counterintel. Yeah, good question. Over here.
I asked this offline earlier, but it was during lunch. Knowing the difference between what constitutes plagiarism and what constitutes necessary verbiage.
Okay, so the question was, how do you know the difference between plagiarism versus just what's necessary to capture a thought? And that kind of ties into what we were saying over here about the jargon and the unfamiliar language. Or specific thought. These are all really solid questions. Unfortunately, because we only have limited time in the session, we're not going to be able to get as deep into all of these as I'd like. But the good news is that some of what we're going to talk about today connects these two issues together. While we may not be able to get absolutely into the specifics of a particular report, for example, where we go into the handbook and talk about how to format it, we can talk about the general principles that lay the foundation for all of these. There are some big concepts that we've identified here that apply to any kind of writing that we'll do. So what I'd like to do is shift gears and start looking not only at the different techniques that you've identified, but how do we really identify them when we see them, and then how do we apply them and the principles behind them to these questions so that we can answer them. All right, so let's go ahead and click over. So one thing I really appreciated was that when we started asking these big picture questions, you know, in terms of how do you apply this concept of Army writing style to the things that we're going to do in this course, some of the questions that came out of it were things like, you know, what are the expectations? How do we know and translate the expectations we receive here into something like a joint environment? Or over here, you know, when we talk about rules like formatting, it can seem like something that's very arbitrary. You know, do we only do that here, or are we going to do that elsewhere? These are really powerful questions to ask, and the reason for that is that you've probably already figured this out, but writing is a social activity, and it involves you as the writer interacting with your audience who you may or may not know, writing for specific purposes and specific times for specific places and purposes and points. Because of that, it means we've got to kind of unpack and structure it. So let me just get a read of the room here for a second here. If you had to name somebody that you thought was an amazing writer, historically speaking, somebody that you thought was like an icon or epitome of amazing writing, who would you name? In the back. All right, we got one for Ernest Hemingway. Other takers? Over here. Thomas Jefferson. If you're going to name one, go for a Patriot. Others? Everyone's like, I don't read. Okay, I heard of Mark Twain. Thomas Paine.
Aldous Huxley.
Aldous Huxley. Ooh, Huxley. I like Huxley. Other takers?
Jean-Paul Sartre.
Jean-Paul Sartre. You're going to make me do French? Okay. Yeah, Jean-Paul Sartre, famous realist and philosopher. Others?
Edgar Allan Poe.
One for Edgar Allan Poe. Nevermore, quoth the raven. Over here.
J.D. Salinger.
J.D. Salinger. Ooh, Catcher in the Rye. Others? All right, so let me ask you this. If we took Ernest Hemingway, J.D. Salinger, or Jean-Paul Sartre and had them write something for Army writing style, how would they do? Okay, I'm hearing a lot of people like, oh, they're going to do awful. Like, but wait a second. You just all said that they were fantastic writers, the epitome or iconoclasts of writing ability. So where would they end up going wrong? Why would you say that they would do terrible? Over here.
Because Army writing style is counterproductive towards creative writing.
Okay, so the answer was Army writing style is counterproductive to writing good literature. All right, why do you think that is? Over here.
Well, like, so Army writing style is to deliver an idea, whereas like those writers are using the medium itself to convey a deeper sense of purpose. So like kind of like a painting, like an abstract painting, the medium itself is conveying something. My battalion commander doesn't care like what deeper meaning behind life I may arrange my paragraph or sentence structure. He just wants to know what I'm trying to say.
Okay, so the answer here was Army writing style is trying to convey a point, whereas great literature is sometimes doing it just for the sake of expressing themselves or showing how to use the medium in terms of identifying words for purposes other than actually making a point. So if we took Jean-Paul Sartre and actually tried to pin him down and said, what was the point of reading that paragraph? He would probably actually fight us on that and say the point is but to read it, not actually to know it or understand it, because that's the kind of philosophy heady space that he's in. So this is the first thing we have to admit when we talk about Army writing and Army writing style, is that we're really talking about, at any given time, negotiating a handful of expectations. And that's where this chart comes in. When we talk about the USAICo writing standard or writing for USAICo, we're really talking about the competition between 3 audiences and 3 groups of readers telling you how to write and what right looks like. On the one hand, because this is the U.S. Army, we're going to have the expectations of U.S. Army style. So going back over here to our lovely board, when I asked you what do you already know about Army writing style, most of this stuff we find in doctrine and field regulations and manuals, right? A lot of AIR 2550 showing up here. Use active voice, be concise, use a bluff, make sure it's structured. And I even heard our sergeant over here say,
Single rapid reading.
Single rapid reading, thank you. In any case, that's one of the defining features here. Us, a group of shared, experienced writers who know who our audience is at specific times and places, writing for a very specific purpose, will generate and know what that standard's supposed to look like and what that guideline is. Sometimes it's defined in our regulations and pamphlets, sometimes it's in the handbooks. We talk about specific formatting for reports. But ultimately, there's a community of writers that decides what right looks like. And as long as we're all in agreement, we know what those expectations are and how to measure those, we tend to find that we can look at the same material and say, this is a good writer or this is a bad writer. So again, we take Ernest Hemingway and we apply him to Army writing style. If he didn't know to write for this and he doesn't know who his audience is, he fails miserably. Not because he doesn't know how to use language, but because he just doesn't know who his audience is. Similarly, because you're in a learning environment, there's a whole confluence of expectations that come out of the academic world. Again, when I said, what would you like to know? Somebody brought up plagiarism, right? The ability to handle other people's material and with respect to intellectual property, right? And again, that's where this comes from. Because we're in an academic environment, and you have to write sometimes in an academic style, you may have to do things that don't necessarily overlap easily with the Army writing file. I'll give you an example. For those of you who have ever written, anyone here ever write an APA style, American Psychological Association? All the NCO hands go up, okay. So are you allowed to use passive voice in APA? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, they use it all the time, so much so, they love it. If you're reading a research paper, 9 times out of 10, they'll say the participants were given a drug, right? And they do this to create objectivity. There it's okay, here not so much. So we have this conflict to be aware of sometimes, where because we're in an academic environment and knowing what those expectations are, you may see examples of what right looks like for an academic assignment that doesn't necessarily mesh with what works well for an Army audience. So it's important to be aware of that conflict. Similarly, we're a large professional organization. Because this is a large hierarchical structure with a command chain, you may have to also obey things like good business style writing. In other words, identifying a solid memo or a solid email, a well-crafted policy letter, a fragmentary order. And the way that you would write for that particular style is going to look a lot more like what you might see in the civilian world. Crisp, efficient, expedient, identifying that clear point for clear people at clear times and places. And they overlap greatly. So when we talk about what write looks like, I want to just keep in mind that we're always ever talking about these three things blended together. And as long as they don't contradict each other, that's where we want to live. So if you're writing that research paper and your question is, can I use passive voice because I'm using APA style because I'm in the NCO Academy, my recommendation would be stick to active. Why? Because you're in the Army. And that would be the one contradiction that you would resolve by deferring to the greater authority. Make sense so far? All right. Now, the other reason this is going to be kind of cool is as we start talking about the specific report writing you'll do for this class, this is the same conversation we had with your instructors. And we said, when we look at an IMFR, what does write look like? And what do those features look like? So earlier we had this question about where did that 30-word limit come from? I can't answer that one. Depending on the course and depending on how that conversation went, we ask what write looks like for a particular document. If it's AIR 2550, it's a correspondence piece. And as correspondence, the Army decided 15 words. When we talked about an IMFR, we may have said that 30 words seems about right for the right audience at the right time to convey the right amount of information. So based on the given assignment in your handbook, you may find that there's some specifics about what write looks like as a genre, because the way that you would write that report for this audience will be different from the other ways that you would write for other audiences and other kinds of genres. Make sense? All right, let's move ahead. With that in mind, I want to focus on the 5 things you already brought up. Again, we've got some experienced writers in here, so I'm not surprised to see that you've identified the 5 things that we would talk about when we say makes for good Army writing style. When we did a survey of all the instructors and students who work at USAICo and asked them what write looks like when it comes to Army writing, these are the 5 things they identified more often than anything else. A sense of purpose. Purpose is the ability to create that bottom line up front, maintain that sense of priority for the main point throughout the document as a whole. And that means you've got it from start to finish of the document, but that you also have it if you've got a paragraph, a bullet list, or even a sentence that you put the most important information first. Analysis, the ability to break down a situation into its constituent parts to see how they interrelate to one another and the importance of it. When we were asking about it before and we talked about understanding that audience, that's really that analysis piece of knowing who it is that you're presenting to and why. What is it that they really need to know? We talked about syntax or this active voice issue, the ability to construct a sentence, and the Army is very specifically concerned about active versus passive voice. And you've already pointed it out. Of the two, they prefer active voice, and we'll get a little bit into why. We also mentioned concision, jamming the most amount of information into the shortest possible space. And finally, accuracy. One thing that was interesting is when we talked about what people wanted to learn, many of these questions had to deal with accuracy itself. What is the right format? What should the right word count look like? As you continue with the course, you'll also have to ask about factual accuracy. Are you presenting the right information to the right people at the right time? Both of these elements make up that accuracy feature, whether you're being grammatically, mechanically, punctuationally accurate, or whether you're presenting right information. So I'm going to refer to the USAICoWriting standard. You may hear your instructors refer to it as well, but this is what they're talking about. These 5 skills that, as Army writers, we've already identified are important for Army writing. All right, so let's tackle the first one, purpose. All right, and like we mentioned before, purpose is probably the most straightforward one we've got. So earlier when we were talking about what we already know about it, somebody mentioned the bluff, the bottom line up front. So let me ask a question in the group here. Does anyone here know where the term bottom line up front comes from? What discipline or job or occupation? Over here?
Journalism?
Ooh, journalism. Actually, yes, they use it too, but they're not the ones who originated it. Sorry, the question was journalism, whether or not journalism was the one that started it. Close. Any other takers? Oh, in the back.
Business?
In business. Okay, what part of business?
Administration?
Yeah, pretty close. The answer was business and administration. It comes from business and accounting, but you're pretty close to the money here. The term bottom line up front comes from accounting, the math industry. And the idea was if you were the head of a large corporation as the CEO and you wanted to determine the health of your company in a snapshot in any given moment, you would ask for your accountants to give you the bottom line. Are we in the red? Are we in the black? right? Are we in debt or are we in the clear? Because the answer to that question is going to determine the course of action I take to move the company, either towards greater profit or out of debt itself, right? So that's the same idea that the Army used when they took bottom line up front. They're like, I don't necessarily need to know all of the math. I just need to know what the conclusion is. Am I in the red or am I in the black? So that's what we're talking about here. Army audiences expect and they really need that sense of priority, and they need it maintained throughout the document so they don't get lost. If you go ahead and click ahead, let's just go ahead and reveal all the text on this slide. All right, so what we're really saying about this is two parts. One is the sort of formal feature of bottom line up front. Whenever you write a document, be it 100 pages or one paragraph, you put the most important information first. And so if you're writing an email, it goes in the subject line of the first line of the document. If you're writing a research paper, in the top of the first paragraph. Whatever, it means that you got to introduce your information as quickly as humanly possible. Now the principle of this, though, also holds to the rest of the document. We would also recommend that whatever you're writing, whichever section of the paper, paragraph, if you've got a bullet list, that you always put the most important piece of information first off of there. And that aids this piece of information, that single rapid reading. And the idea is that if I'm scanning the document and all I hit was the first thing that you wrote in every section, I should still be able to walk away and have a general sense of what the document's about. Make sense so far? Yeah. This is the one that I think people understand usually the quickest. And it's a lot of fun because if you get it right, it means that you can skate by and get away with a lot more with the audience. All right, let's move to the next one, analysis. All right, analysis is a fun one. Because this is a counter-intel group, you probably recognize that there's a contrast at times of what your job looks like. On the one hand, it's very heavily journalistic. You got to know the who, you got to know the what, you got to know the where, you got to know the when. And you have to get those details with ruthless efficiency, right? Some of the reports that I've seen produced by the class go into excruciating detail about the who's, the what's, and the where's, and the when's. All of which is fine. But what I also noticed, though, is that a lot of your reports have a little nugget at the end called agent's comments, right? And that's where they finally want to know that how and the why. They want to know what's really important about this, and that's something that I thought was really fascinating. So I think it's worth breaking down a little bit. If you go ahead and click ahead. When we talk about writing good analysis, what we really mean is whether or not you can kind of tell the difference between whether you're summarizing information, the who, the what, the where, the when, or if you can break down that information into something useful. So for example, here's an example of summary and paraphrase. This is the who, the what's, and the where's. Military officers and enlisted men wear green uniforms with camouflage even during peacetime training. All right. Do we have a who in that statement? Do we have a what? Do we have a where? More or less. Do we have a when? Yeah. All right. Do you see anything in that statement that says why this is important or why soldiers wear it? All right. Now you guys are all experienced soldiers in here, even without looking at the screen here. Why do you guys think that you all have to wear uniforms all the time? You're like, because otherwise we'd be naked. Like, over here?
Maintains uniformity.
Yeah, okay, exactly. The root word itself, uniformity. It promotes uniformity or that sense of group cohesion. Why else do you guys think that you wear? Yeah.
Good order and discipline.
Maintains order and discipline, right? Has you follow a routine. Yeah. Okay, what else? You can even just like look at the board now. Over here.
I guess in a sense it conveys with professionalism, almost a badge of office in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. So the answer was it conveys professionalism and a badge of office. I would say so. I think one sort of miraculous element to the uniform is that it has everyone's name and rank on it. I've actually met soldiers, and most of you can probably do this too, who can read an entire soldier's history just by examining all of the various patches and experiences that are listed on their arm and on their uniforms. I think all that's really cool stuff. And that really gets at the how and the why. There's more to it than just like, well, somebody told us to do it, so we're doing it. If we got into the how and the why, the analysis of it, we realized there are a lot of really good reasons and good arguments for making sure that soldiers wear uniforms all the time, even during peacetime training. So when you're writing your assignments and you're writing your reports, your instructors are going to look for two things. They're going to find out when you need to summarize how much you're doing, and when you need to analyze how much you're doing proportionally on the page and grade you on it. As long as you're sticking to that idea of remembering that who's, what's, where's, and when's are summary versus the how's and the why's of analysis, you should do fine. All right, make sense so far? Again, for a lot of you, I know this is pretty basic. All right, let's move on. Syntax. All right, this is our active versus passive voice construction issue. Wow, and all of a sudden the pens came out, there are notes flying. All right, good. I'm glad to see that you guys are excited about verbs. I am too. They're active, they're happening. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. I'm about to geek out. But let's talk a little bit about active voice. So we know that the Army prefers active voice over passive voice. My question to you is, all right, first, what is the difference between active and passive voice? Does anyone know? Over here?
Active voice is when something is doing something. Passive voice is when something happened to something.
Okay, so the answer was active voice is when something is in the front of the sentence doing something, and passive voice is when it's receiving the action in the back end. That's absolutely correct. Active voice puts the doer of action at the front of the sentence, and the structure for that generally is going to be who is doing what to whom. The subject of the sentence plus the verb in the middle plus the effect at the end of the sentence. Passive voice is going to flip that around and put the effect first. So the door was opened, puts the recipient of the action at the front of the sentence instead. All right, so we know that they prefer active over passive. My next question is this. Why do you think the Army prefers active over passive based on what we just said? Over here.
Passive voice can be confusing to read and adds unnecessary fluff to whatever you're writing.
Okay, so two features behind that. He said, first of all, it may add unnecessary fluff, and that violates one of the principles we mentioned over here. Short and sweet as possible, and you're right. A passive construction generally, by definition, will include more words than its active voice counterpart. And then the second one he said is it creates confusion. Can you unpack the creates confusion part?
So a active voice is very simple. You have the subject, the verb, and the effect or the object of the verb. In a passive voice, because you're adding those words to it, it's kind of difficult to follow the flow of the sentence and ultimately the flow of whatever you're writing. It just adds an unnecessary step and adds an unnecessary amount of concentration to it.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you right, it reverses the focus and adds the concentration on the wrong element. We'd rather know who the doer is than the recipient of action. Am I hearing that right? And then over here, you had your hand.
The other thing, passive will disguise the subject of the sentence, or who's the actual active participant in the action. So the door was open, but we don't know who opened the door at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. So the answer was it'll disguise the subject of the sentence, and I think that's absolutely right. A couple of years ago, I was working with a chief warrant officer who introduced us to the by zombies test, and it's the same idea. If I create a passive construction, there's a good chance I can drop the who's doing something out of the sentence entirely. But if I'm reading a sentence and I don't know who's doing something, like the door was opened, and I can add the words by zombies, then I know I'm probably looking at a missing subject somewhere. So let's look at an example. Here's one that we put together a while back for the presentation. Sergeant Master guarded the critical supplies for the general. All right, the reason I think the Army really loves this is exactly what you were saying. It emphasizes the accountability. If we put the who is doing what and to whom in that order, it means we're always doing our bottom line up front of the sentence, the subject, the doer of the action at the front of the sentence. And I think that's very impactful to know who's doing what at any given time. They're the agent of action, the agent of change. And because of that, we always know who's accountable. If I say, the Sergeant McMaster, lost the supplies, I know who's accountable for it, Sergeant McMaster. Meanwhile, to create a passive voice construction, you have to use an additional verb to make the sentence work. So generally, you'll start by taking the object of the sentence, jamming it at the front, and then adding the verb to be somewhere in the middle here. That's is, was, were, are, some variation of that conjugation, plus a past tense verb, which means you're already doubling up. And this goes back to what we were saying about making the sentence longer, right? So we've hit two of these points. By putting the subject at the back of the sentence, it can be more obscure. By adding more words, it can get longer. Now here's the catch, and this is where I think a lot of people get tripped up. If I put a period right there, the critical supplies for the general were guarded, hard stop. Is that sentence shorter? Is it more concise? Is it grammatically correct? It is. It meets all of those criteria. Is it clearer? No. All right, and that's our catch. This is why I think the Army really does not like passive voice and is suspicious of it, because you can create a short, grammatically correct, informative sentence and still omit the agent of action and hide who's doing something at any given time. So if, again, we're having that conversation, it can very easily go into weasel talk. Like, all right, who lost the shipment? And you're like, I don't know, but it got lost. By whom? By zombies? What are you talking about here? Take some ownership. So there are very few instances where you're going to use passive voice, but it's important to know why that we have that focus. 9 times out of 10, it's on active voice because of the promotion of accountability. Now, there is always one exception to the rule. As with anything in grammar, you may find an occasion where passive voice is the more important of the two. And what was interesting is we actually found it in some of the reports that you guys looked at. There are times when you don't know who the agent of action is. That person is a subject unknown, and because of that, you only know what happened afterwards. So this example here, blood supplies were contaminated and were distributed to soldiers who were admitted to the medical station. Don't know who contaminated it. Don't know how they got in there, but they're there. And sometimes that effect, people are in danger, is more important than the cause of it, which we may not know. Here, the second example, however, the cure was administered in time to prevent adverse effects. Do I care if it was a medic who gave me the cure or if it was a doctor who gave me the cure? No, what matters? I got the cure in time before something went really, really wrong. So you may find situations in this course where there's that exception to the rule. So just want to point that out there. Going all the way back to what we said before, our expectation may be for writing correspondence documents to the Army that we always use active voice. But in practicality, because you're writing CI reports that convey specific kinds of information for specific audiences, you may find 1 out of 10 times that active voice is the way to go. So keep it as a tool in the toolbox and try to use active voice whenever possible, but remember that it's still a useful tool in the box. Make sense so far? All right, let's move on. Concision, jamming the most amount of information in the shortest possible space. All right, now this was a fun one. This kind of is going to drive towards this idea here. How do we pack the big ideas into small words and sentences? Especially when we have to convey large, abstract, or difficult concepts to understand. Go ahead and click out next. What we generally find is that this is one of the more difficult aspects of writing when it comes to Army writing style for this reason. That it's possible to inflate things and not add anything to the meaning, to reduce the overall length of sentences and add nothing, and then try to find that right balance where it's right in the middle. So here's an example. One challenge we gave to a class was to try and convey a simple idea. Boss wants to see you. That's where we told them to start with. Right? So you can invent a person, you can invent what they need to see them about, but try to write the longest possible sentence you can to convey that same idea. And here's what we got. This is the fluff or churched up version. This adds a bunch of extra words without adding extra in meaning. Major General McMasters requests that you attend forthwith to his office for an impromptu meeting with as much haste as you can spare regarding the captain of the guard. All right, 26 words for that bad boy. I said before, this is fluffed and churched up. What looks extra to you? What could you cut? All right, so you said the majority of the sentence. I agree. All right, could we narrow that down a little bit? What are some things that you see are problems? Yeah.
A lot of the wording, so to me it looks like something that I would have written in college for a history paper because it adds an unnecessary amount of words and what I would consider complicated words like forthwith and impromptu that aren't really adding information to the sentence. It's just adding extra words.
Yep. So we have these injected adverbs. Attend what? Forthwith. It's this added word. Somebody over here earlier when we were talking about aspects of good Army writing said keep it simple, right? We're actually aiming for a very simplistic audience with a very small vocabulary. People don't generally use the word forthwith in a conversation. Anyone else see any other words in here that look like that forthwith problem? Yeah, over here.
As much haste as you can spare.
Yeah, as much haste as you can spare. Maybe he could have just said now. You're right. There's a lot of these extra little participial phrases and clauses they're sticking in there. So again, we could convey that same with a single word instead of using 7. Somebody else, when I asked for hands, said haste over here.
Impromptu.
Yeah, an impromptu. I don't think anyone uses that word outside of an SAT test. So again, this is a very rare instance of that word. So if we added all of that up, I think we know what we're looking for. And you don't have to be a great writer to recognize it. You just look for words that most people don't know most of the time, where they use a great excess of small words, or they're using something that's so rare as vocabulary as nobody would know it. All right, so we took that same question and gave it to a different group and said, all right, we want you to make this as succinct as possible. And succinct is not exactly the same as concise, and here's the difference. They wrote, Major General McMasters, you see right away. Is that shorter than the first one? Is it clearer to understand? All right, I see some people like, yeah, it's kind of clearer. All right, why? What's missing? Is there some information that was in the first one that wasn't in the second? Right, and that's the difference between concise and succinct in a nutshell. In a concise sense, we would say you have all the right information for the audience. In a succinct version, you can get short, but you start to lose important bits. This kind of goes back to that passive voice problem of when we cut off the Major General McMaster's sentence. And here he says, look, he needs to see you right away. For most people, that's enough to operate. But it'd be helpful to know why, right? If somebody just tells me the boss wants to see me, my first reaction is like, oh crap, am I in trouble? Wait, what happened? So getting that little piece about, seeing you about the captain and the guard actually helps to reduce the situation. So that's our last version. Major General McMaster's needs to meet with you about the captain and the guard right away. We have the who, we have the what, we have the where, we got the when, and we also get a sense of that importance conveyed. So that's what we're aiming for, is that sweet spot, all right, between overdoing it and between underdoing it. Make sense? All right, now when you guys are writing your reports, that's going to vary a little bit, and that kind of goes back to this 30-word limit thing. Some documents need more explanation than others. So if I was working with a group of captains in the MIC and they're writing an academic research paper, they might need sentences as long as 30 words. I'm doing a good AR 2550 correspondence document. My sentences better be an average of 15 words or less. Make sense? All right, so you just got to be aware of what the requirement is per the specific assignment. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Yeah, that part's not so important. Let's keep going. All right, accuracy. All right, we mentioned before there's two parts to accuracy, being factually accurate with what you said, and also obeying the usual rules of grammar, mechanics, punctuation, spelling. If you could reveal just that first line with the red in it. Keep going. Yep, right here. This is good. One of the things that we do is work with some classes that use online discussion boards for homework. And we found this little gem at the end of a very long exchange. So I don't want you to get the wrong impression when you read this sentence that this was somehow a group of soldiers writing about Disneyland. No, as it turns out, that was just how the conversation devolved. Near the end of the exchange, somebody wrote this sentence. Everyone knows that Walt Disney is the creator of Ricky Mouse. ... That's why people to Disneyland. All right. Now I'm betting that even though you guys are not a room full of professional grammar checkers, copy editors, or English teachers, that you can identify at least a couple of things wrong with that sentence. Do you notice anything that just jumps out as being like dead wrong grammatically over here?
Everyone.
Everyone. Okay, so he writes out the number. What else?
Vault.
Vault. Yeah, who is Walt Disney? Like maybe heavily accented German. Like yes, he is Walt Disney. But it would be hard to really justify that over here.
That's why people to Disneyland.
Yeah, missing a verb here. Go to Disneyland, went to Disneyland, what to Disneyland? Over here.
Creator.
Creator's misspelled. It should be O-R instead of E-R. Over here.
Ricky Mouse.
Ricky Mouse, just like Walt Disney. I thought that one would jump out at people first. Like, one person was like, I thought it was Ricky Mouse. You mean it's not? He was like freaked out. I think we ruined someone's childhood that way. Yeah, Ricky Mouse. Again, a factual accuracy problem. Out of curiosity, any other nitpickers in here find anything else wrong? Over here?
There's really no connection between the two sentences. Even the idea doesn't flow from one to the other.
Yeah, and we parsed that up with using the ellipsis. But you're right, the two ideas don't connect. This guy was getting a little bit more on the random side too. This would violate our good purpose features we mentioned before. We were like, what are you talking about anymore? But
Ricky Mouse is after the preposition. It's after the preposition.
An exclamation mark.
Oh, okay. I think I see where you're going with that. I think he's got bigger fish to fry. Over here?
That should have an apostrophe.
Yeah, that should have an apostrophe. I think that's the other one that usually people notice too, is a punctuation problem. All right, now, this is a good point though. Aside from putting the preposition before the noun, let me just ask you guys this. If you had to identify on this guy's writing, and you know he needs help, do you notice that he does any one mistake more often than anything else? Spelling. Yeah, absolutely. If we can put up the next one. So here's that same sentence corrected. He may have a lot of individual errors, and I see a lot of NCOs in the room, so I know you know that you have probably had to be the fact checker or grammar checker for people in the past. So it's real easy to get into that habit. It doesn't take a great writer to spot bad writing like that, right? Even if we couldn't put our finger on it, like, hey, he's missing a word here. You're right, missing verb. Like, oh, there's an apostrophe missing. Yeah. We got a sense that there were some things going seriously wrong. What we talked about when we said what makes for solid Army writing in a CI course or any other was the ability to be grammatically correct enough that you don't lose the audience. In this case, his spelling problem has created a multitude of issues that have affected his ability to be factually accurate because, I mean, if I was reading this in a more serious context, like a CI report, and he got the name Ricky instead of Mickey, we're talking about two totally different people all of a sudden, and that could be a big time problem. If he misses, some of the punctuation and it changes the meaning of a sentence like that, that's why people to Disneyland, that could suddenly tank an entire interpretation of something that happened. But a lot of this comes out of that spelling issue. So that's what we instructed your cadre to look for, is to examine your writing and look for those patterns of problems. And we generally recommend to people that that's what you do if you're reviewing somebody else's paper or even your own, that you focus on these patterns of errors. You might have noticed that he's got about 8 or 9 different mistakes, but he's really only got about 2 big problems. And if he can correct that one problem, the spelling issue, he could fix 6 out of 8 of those problems. Make sense? All right. I also highly recommend this for you. If you're in a position or role of authority where you have to review a lot of documents, and who knows, maybe in a year or two you'll come back and be cadre yourselves. It is not always worth your time to check every single individual error like an editor unless you absolutely have to. In general, I think it's better to pass that information on to the student, help them identify, because if they can see the pattern, they'll get a lot more bang for their buck. Okay, go to the next one. All right, so yeah, just like I said, look for patterns, not just errors. And in the end here, your instructors are going to look for the same. All right, so that in a nutshell is Army writing style as it applies to the USAICoEWriting standard. And to help kind of reiterate the techniques that you'll need for successful writing in an Army course. What I'd like to do now is give you guys an example of a correspondence document. So this is a sample of an email. And if I could just recruit a little help here, would you mind passing it down to this side? And if you could pass it down to this side, much appreciated. I'd like to give you guys a little bit of practice looking at it for this. So again, we all know most of these features, right? When we ask what makes for good Army writing, we came up with them pretty quickly. But now we've really drilled down to some specifics and some specific techniques. So let's say for the moment that in your capacity in a large professional organization that you're in charge of a group of soldiers, and one of them gives you this email. It says, hey, I want to ask for some time off. Will you look at this first before I send it up? What do I need to fix? Yes. Here you go. Thank you. So here's what I'd like you to do. Take a look at this sample. So the person writing it, Captain, is Corporal Brian Smith writing to a Captain R.J. Peterson. He asks you to take a look at it first. What are some of the features that you might notice on here? Go ahead and take 5 minutes, read it over, and try to catch as many of these issues as you see. How would you recommend to this guy that he fix his purpose? Right? Where's his bottom line up front? How would you place it differently, if at all? Are there any accuracy features that you notice? Concision problems. I recommend reading it once through all the way just to kind of get a feel for it, and then doubling back and making your notes. All right, in any case, to illustrate the point, when your instructors look at writing or when you look at writing, what we recommend is that you take a similar approach, that you know what the standard is that applies to the specific document you're looking for, you know what techniques that you're looking for, and you mark them. And as we already identified, you don't have to be a fantastic grammatical expert in order to identify a lot of individual little problems that are there. The hope, though, is that this gives you a way to balance it out. So even though he's really bad in one area, for example, accuracy, he's actually doing okay in something like syntax. And this is how we create these assessments. So again, when you get your papers back from your cadre, you'll know a little bit about how they arrived at your writing score. All right, so we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back for the next part. Normally at this point, I would go through and say, what did we learn from all of this? But I think that would be redundant. It seems like we all generally understood this one, and this is a more experienced audience, so I'm not going to berate that. Suffice it to say, here's what we know. When you write your reports in the CI community, you're going to adhere to many of the features that apply to good Army writing style as we've identified them, but get them even more specific to the genre and audience for which you're writing. And in doing so, that may be looking at specific handbooks or the expectations of academia or the business world writing to really tease out how you apply these expectations in these situations. The next thing that we're going to look at then is the more formal kinds of writing. Because CI work involves a lot of detail-oriented analysis, we're going to talk a little bit about how to construct arguments out of this kind of information and actually turn that analysis into something that's very meaningful. So instead of just asking for somebody, I need time off, how to actually create a claim, followed by the introduction of evidence and justifications for that evidence so that people can understand it. And that will get all the way back to this very first question we had about presenting the right information to the right people at the right time, so that, just like we mentioned with the bottom line up front, that they get the point and they understand what the point is and why that point is relevant to them. So again, for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, I'm Dr. Andrew Winslow from the USAICoEWriting program. I'm happy to be here today to talk to you a little bit about some features of writing. In our previous session, we talked a little bit about the form of writing, and we talked about what write looks like when we talk about Army writing style and how it might apply to a CI course. And specifically spelled out those features that either show up in the Army expectations or professional expectations from the business world or from the schoolhouse itself in training that may affect the way that we have to write for certain audiences at certain times and certain places. This next session we're going to do is going to be a bit more on the active side, because we're going to shift gears and talk about a different technique of writing, which is the formulation of arguments. So you probably have already gotten your toe in the water and know that a big part of what we do, especially when we were talking about it last time in terms of analysis, is separating those features of who, what, where, and when, and then really digging into the meat of the how and the why. And because we mentioned in Army writing style that the bottom line up front is probably the most important feature that we work with, it's important to know how that plays into making an argument. So where we left off was looking at that student sample writing of correspondence where he was asking for time off, and he finished with a question and buried his lead, and possibly the most important thing he needed to say, can I get a day off and get a day pass, got buried all the way at the end of the email. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to construct an argument, what that looks like, especially with the Army writing style features in mind. Now, to kind of warm up to this a little bit, I'm going to give you guys a fictional scenario, and I want you to kind of work with me a little bit on this. So this will be a little bit relevant because of the heat of the room here. But let's imagine you're in a hot classroom, or it's a very hot day, and you're feeling a bit on the dehydrated side, right? And you have two pieces of fruit in front of you, a banana and an orange. If you were going to be thinking about which one would be better off for you, how many of you, by show of hands, would say that you're better off on a hot day, feeling dehydrated, eating the orange? Okay, by show of hands, how many of you say you're better off eating the banana? All right. So let's dig into some detail about this, because that was actually, 2/3 said orange, 1/3 said banana, so I think there might be some details out there we don't know. So let's start off with the orange group. For those of you who said you're better off eating the orange, my question would be, all right, why? What are some things I need to know about eating an orange that are beneficial to me about overcoming dehydration? In the back.
I just figured that the high amount of juice that you get out of eating an orange, high amount of liquid.
Okay. High juice content. Other details about the orange that would be better for me? Those of you who said orange.
I said it tastes better.
Tastes better. Okay, we got one for taste better. Other reasons why I'd be better off with the orange?
Banana's gonna get mushy. Banana's gonna get mushy.
Okay, so this is more of a negative against the banana. I'm going to put that up here with a minus. Might get mushy. Okay. Benefits of the orange? In the back?
With the banana, it might be more of a dry texture in your mouth. With the orange, again, with the liquid, it's not going to make your mouth so dry.
All right, so I'm going to put that here as the negative. You said dry texture, possibly. Whereas over here, it'll be a moist texture. And again, if I'm feeling very, very thirsty, that might feel pretty good on a dry, raspy tongue. All right. Anybody in here have any weigh-in about the nutritional content of the orange? Is there anything else that it might have, nutritionally speaking, might be better on a hot day?
Vitamin C.
All right, so somebody said vitamin C. Definitely.
Banana has potassium. Potassium pushes water out of muscles.
Here we go. Oh, sorry, that's not a negative. That's a positive. Oh, wait, no, that is, wait, is that a negative or positive? Negative, okay. Potassium. And for pushing water out of muscles. All right, so that's a negative over here. Probably retain water in muscles. All right. Other benefits of the orange? I'm going to give the banana guys here a second, a chance to defend themselves. All right, so let's hold off on the orange then. For those of you who said the banana is your better choice, educate us. Over here.
Bananas are highly glycemic. It's going to be better for replenishing your electrolytes.
Okay, for those of you who didn't hear that, he said they're highly glycemic and better for replenishing your electrolytes. It's going to be hard to argue those facts. All right, so let me try to say high glycemic, cemia, and more electrolytes. I'm just going to abbreviate as more electrolytes. That kind of get it, what you were saying? Okay. And then over here?
Back on the potassium with the banana, I think that would actually be a positive. When you get hot, you sweat. When you sweat out salts, namely sodium and potassium. The banana will replace potassium and potentially even help maintain homeostasis.
Whoa, big word. Okay. So again, it was pushes out. Wait, can you say it one more time, and then I'm going to repeat it for the camera.
So you get hot, you sweat out salts, potassium being one of the main salts you sweat out. And it will help replace the potassium that you've lost through sweat. And being a salt, it might actually even help maintain homeostasis.
And help homeostasis. And for those of us who are like me and don't know what homeostasis is,
It'll possibly help you maintain your water balance.
okay, so maintaining homeostasis is maintaining your water balance. So it might be better at helping to keep and maintain that water level. Other defenders of the banana, over here.
Yes, bananas also contain dopamine and serotonin. Dopamine, which is a feel-good chemical for the brain, and serotonin helps the neurotransmitter of the brain to use the dopamine.
Yeah, so again, to repeat it, he said it contains dopamine and serotonin, two neurotransmitters, and because of that, the dopamine will help with your mood regulation, and the serotonin will help with, what was the serotonin for again?
It's helps with the neurotransmitters that actually use it.
Yep, and helps use the chemicals in your brain. So probably better mental acuity is what I would say. Yeah.
So having the two, with it getting mushy quicker, I would eat banana first because then the orange is going to stay better longer. So if I'm in a classroom all day, that orange is there and has to pick me up later on. So.
All right, so I'm putting here's a positive here. Stays fresher longer. The negative over here was the a retort to the mushiness. Good rebuttal. Benefits of the banana still. Over here we haven't heard from you yet.
Bananas aren't as messy, require less work.
Requires less work, okay. Require less work. And when you say they require less work, can you elaborate?
Well, peeling a banana is a lot easier than peeling orange, and if you don't have a knife, it's going to be hard to do in a classroom. You're just going to have little pieces of orange peel all over the place.
Okay. So you mean like the actual physical part of the peeling is a lot easier with a banana than it is for the orange. Interesting point. Over here?
So one of y'all medics can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the orange is going to be more simple carbohydrates and the banana is going to be more complex carbohydrates, which means that you're going to burn through it a lot less quickly.
Okay, so over here, because it's complex carbs, and that means you'll burn through it slower. So sustained energy, I want to just abbreviate. Wow, I'm getting all the way to the bottom of the board here, so it's going to get very sloppy. And then over here you said is the negative, it's simple carbs. And that means less energy overall, or shorter burst. All right, so we got quite a bit here. Anyone else have something they absolutely have to say about the orange or the banana before we move on? I'm just curious. Yes, over here.
Banana milkshake tastes better than orange juice.
Okay. And then flavor. If you eat the banana, you're probably going to enjoy the flavor more, especially if it's in a milkshake. I'm just going to add that one here as flavor for the milkshake. And over here, negative flavor. Okay. Now this is kind of interesting, and I'm surprised because the last time we did this exercise with this group of students from the CI course, they were all dead set in favor of the banana. They said the banana is totally going to be your best bet if you want to rehydrate. And some of the reasons they gave were similar to the ones that you gave here. So it's interesting that we're coming up with a debate here. Do we have anybody in here who's like an expert on nutrition who just knows that there's a definitive answer? I thought you might raise your hand. Leave it to the guy who brought up the salt protein, or sorry, the high glycemia and electrolytes. In any case, we'll leave this open-ended for right now about which one's better. The point of this, though, is to use a finite data set and try to come up with some kind of claim. So again, I ask a question, and this is very similar to the kind of Intel questions you're going to get. What do I do about X, Y, or Z situation? So in this case, it said, look, I've got two options here, banana or an orange. Which one's better for me? And what did you guys do? You sorted through a particular kind of data set to make a claim about which one would be better. Claim, the banana is better for you. Why? Because of this information here. And then we reasoned it out a little bit. In essence, this is the basics of any kind of argument that you'll ever set up. And that could be whether you're talking about the debate between what's a better fruit on a hot day, or it could be something as complicated as the proposed use of an intel source. In other words, how do we think this person will value U.S. intelligence in this area and arena? You're probably going to go through the same process. This person's valuable because, and then give a list of reasons and then justify those reasons. We'll come back to this a little bit later to talk a little bit about this comparison, but it's interesting to find that that was the detail we came up with. I appreciate you guys being good sports about it and going through that, and hopefully some minds got changed here. I'd like to find out at the end here if somebody who started on the orange, actually let's find that out. Did anyone here start by voting for the orange and now you want to vote for the banana? Persuasion occurred. We have proof. Yes. Interesting point. And that actually evens it out to about 50-50. Okay, so let's get into the details of an argument, but we'll get a chance to practice this again in a little bit. Let's go ahead and click forward. All right. So a minute ago when I said, here's the fictional scenario, what do we do about it in terms of breaking it down and figuring out what the best course of action was, we had to identify some things. In order to create a claim that you guys did, which is I should eat the orange because, or I should eat the banana because, you had to construct the first part of an argument, or the claim. And we talked about this last time as the main point, the bottom line up front. That one do-or-die statement that helps me as the audience understand what it is you're trying to convince me of as a course of action, a dedicated piece of information that helps me make a decision, and so on and so forth. So that's the first part of the argument that we want to focus on, the claim. Who should you vote for president? Which piece of banana or orange should you eat first? What tastes better, the banana milkshake or the orange milkshake? Whatever it's going to be, starts with that claim, that nugget of information that proposes something. Then at some point you're going to want to do some kind of data. We had a lot of evidence that was coming up here. And notice that we had more than one type. We had some people who offered factual data and said, look, if I'm a good scientist or nutritionist, I might know a lot about its glycemia index, or I might know about how much electrolyte value one fruit has over the other. But we also had some that came from experience, that some people over here started with, hey, I think that this fruit gets mushier. It's actually probably more difficult to eat over time. And we also had the benefit of experience from expert sources, where one person in here had mentioned before that the dry texture, it's the kind of thing you would only get from actually eating those two kinds of fruits. And if you were having the same conversation in front of somebody who never had a banana or an orange, you might rely on that kind of experience to defend it. That's data. It's the evidence that we introduce to defend that claim. So if I say this is an important area for operations, I better have a good why behind it with some kind of data. A warrant is the third part. Warrants are the justification that show how that data proves that claim and really gives it some support. We didn't get that deep in here, but the next step of an argument would have been probably to break some of these down and say, okay, you mentioned before that banana has a higher glycemia level and more electrolytes. Why is that important? And then he teased it out. He's like, well, if we were going to justify that, the body only functions when it can balance its sugars and has enough electrolytes in it, and the banana is better at replenishing both. And that would be the warrant of it, the rationale behind the choice and showing how that data helps to prove that point. At some point, you might also need that thing they call the backing. This is sort of a tricky part of the argument. It doesn't always make an appearance, but in here there's a mutual understanding, and we didn't have to talk about it. Then if we're talking about rehydrating, we might think about why that's important for a soldier to be hydrated at all times. Actually, come to think of it, the sergeant over here actually did kind of hint at it. that in terms of performance, to be at your best, you would want the better fruit. And to determine the better fruit, you might have to think about whether you need sustained energy or short-term energy as a rationale behind this. And that might be the backing of it. It's thinking about, why is this argument really relevant? What's really important about it? And last but not least, you might want to have some sort of refutation or rebuttal. Without even really intending to, you probably noticed that a lot of people were thinking about what the better fruit would be by what the worse fruit might be. Right? They were thinking of it in terms of the opposite. I might want the orange because of this negative feature about the banana. Right? But there's no mystery behind the refutation. If you're ever making an argument, you don't ever have to undercut yourself, but recognizing that there are strengths and weaknesses out there is a big part of it. So again, when talking about the benefits of an orange, saying it's got higher water or juice content and tastes better or has a moist texture, I may want at some point to say, yeah, it's possible that banana might get mushy, which is another reason why you might want to pay attention to the firmness and fiber that is included in an orange instead. Right? To be able to defer to some of these arguments as you make your points. So those are the main parts of the argument. We're going to break them down one by one and kind of go through them and then give you guys some practice in a little bit here to define it. My goal for the end of this session is that you guys will not only understand the parts of an argument, but be able to make an argument yourselves. Yeah, we'll get to that part in a sec. All right, let's break it down. I'll start with the claims, if you click next. All right, when we talk about the anatomy of an argument, especially for Army-style writing, we usually will see the elements in this kind of order. They're going to begin with that claim, and click next, introduce some sort of data, and then the warrant. And that's usually where an Army argument will stop. All right, I'm just pointing this out there to be very clear and very precise about it. We're going to learn a little bit more about the parts of an argument in case you need them, but these are the three nuggets that you're going to see more often than not. The claim might be, this person will be a good use of intel in a particular arena. Data, here's his motivation, his level of access, the psychological profile behind him that makes him willing to work with the U.S. And then the warrant, well, because this guy has an unprecedented level of access, we know that he'll be valuable for that reaching intel objective, and so on. There's a very clear connection between the claim of how we think something ought to operate with the data we need to introduce and then the warrant that justifies it. The other parts, if they come up at all, will kind of come up on a case-by-case basis. You might need to include the backing. So earlier when we were talking about the Brian Smith email about asking for time off, we touched a little bit on the backing. Does he really need to talk about how sick his mom is or mention the symptoms as we were looking at senses that we could get a hack for? Well, he thought he needed to include it because it was the backing. If caring for my mom is an important priority and the military is an important priority and I, as the writer, have to decide between the two, I wanted you, my audience, to be informed of why I'm choosing my mom over my job, right? So this is where you see some of that stuff coming up in possible arguments. Then if it's going to happen, you probably find a refutation or a rebuttal next to that where they'll include some minor piece of information to refute or strengthen their own argument, followed by, at the end, another claim or a transition. If you click next. In longer arguments especially, what you'll find is that the end of every argument is the introduction of another argument. So just keep in mind that these things tend to roll one after the other. I have my claim, here's what we should do. In terms of the banana versus the orange, I introduce my evidence about why I think it's important. I may justify that answer, but then the last thing I'll do is transition into something. If I already conclude that dopamine and serotonin are in higher concentrations in my banana, how that might affect my decision-making process might then flow in the next part. And it's also less work, right? Then furthering the next claim and the next claim and the next claim. Make sense so far? Yeah. I know for a lot of you too, your experience with this, I see a lot of more senior NCOs in here, so this is kind of old hat. Again, if you're treading water, I appreciate your patience. And if this is new to you, please let me know if you've got any questions. All right, so let's look at them one at a time for examples. Starting with a claim. If you move to the next. All right, when we talk about a claim can be a thesis statement, topic sentence, recommendation, premise, general assumption. In fact, in many of the reports that you're going to write, you don't even actually have to state the claim. The claim is actually built into the title. I know that there's a report that you'll look at later. You haven't looked at it yet, but a basic source data report kind of unpacks it. This is the basic source data that you need to know how valuable this guy is going to be. Some examples. It might be something like the most important priority for commanding officers maintaining discipline by example. A lot of you guys are NCOs and you might already make that claim all the time. I have to set the example because it's important for soldiers to see it and follow through. NCOs demonstrate their professionalism by their desire for continuous development is a claim. Again, there are a lot of ways an NCO might demonstrate professionalism, but constantly seeking out opportunities for professional development would create an argument. You'd have to defend that somehow and show some evidence for it. So we know that we're looking at a claim if it's something, especially if it's debatable, that requires some kind of evidence to prove and then draws people into it because you need some sort of informed opinion or reasoning. You'll know that you're really in a good argument zone if it's something that's actually testable and that you need some sort of evidence for it. You'll notice even with the banana and the orange, we could have just operated at the level of who in here likes oranges and who in here likes bananas and just called it a day. But we got down in here to a real situation. Look, if it's a hot day, this is a realistic scenario in which somebody might need to make an informed choice about the benefits and the pros and cons of a particular piece of fruit in a particular day. So I want to make sure that we're not losing that point in here. We're making claims, we're thinking about the purpose of this for a particular audience to meet certain objectives. All right, next. Data should always be specific to the argument. Again, when we were over here talking about the banana and the orange example, the first thing that people pointed out was, I said the scenario is about being dehydrated. First thing somebody said was water. All right, tell me about the juice content. All right, interesting point of fact, if you didn't already know this, there's about the same amount of water in an orange as there is in a banana. Who knew? So, there's the same amount of water content in this. And what's interesting too is if you're looking at fiber as a category, banana actually scores higher in the fiber category than the orange. All kinds of little bits of interesting little data that come out here. We talked about 3 that came out here that are easily predictable. The facts of the matter, it's the richest source of water and electrolytes. The expertise involved, in my case, mentioned that, you probably noticed I pointed out here, I said, did anyone here know a lot about nutrition? I'm looking for an expert, and we had one person in here who probably studies it. In the last group, we had a bunch of guys who were like a bunch of power lifters, and all they did was like have stacks of books about lifting and getting ripped, and they were like, oh yeah, I'll tell you everything you want to know about a banana, you know. It's like, thank you, you know. This is a kind of a pro-fitness crowd, so we're doing well there in terms of expertise. And then last but not least, we've got the experience of it. So one of the first ones we mentioned before is the tasting better on a hot day. And I think the reason for that is kind of self-evident. If you are hot and you eat an orange, it may have the immediate feel of being refreshing because that's your brain cueing your body that you're doing the right thing. That you need water, this is water-like, and it just suddenly turns on all of those good, happy, joy moments to confirm that your decision was the right one. So these are the 3 kind of data sets that you'll find that come out in almost any argument. Some sort of fact, expertise, or experience that are relevant to the situation. In general, the more relevant the factual information is and the more nuanced it is to the argument, the less explanation it needs. And I think probably you guys saw this too. When we were talking about the water content, that's a pretty easy sell. When we talk about whether or not you use it in a shake, there's a reason why it came out last in the conversation. We went from order of most relevant to least relevant, right? It went from water content to nutrition content, although there was some talk about portability in the middle there, about which one was easier to carry, and some talk about peelability. But dead last came to our opinion about it, was whether or not we thought it would be a good ingredient for a flavor. And that's the same idea. The more relevant the fact is, the easier it comes to the argument, the easier it is to defend, the easier it is to justify. Make sense so far? Okay, any questions so far? All right, let's move on. Warrants. All right, warrants are a rationale. They are usually the part of the argument where you kind of define, here's why I should believe you. And that there's some goodwill that you express as the author to help the reader understand why you're doing this. So for example, you might start off a warrant by asking, all right, why should I believe that fact that you just gave me? All right, you said it's a higher water content. Why should I care about that? Well, if dehydration depletes both water and electrolytes, and you need peak performance to have ample supplies of both, well then it makes sense. I have the link. If you're a soldier, you need peak performance, you need the fruit that has more of both because those are what you're going to need in order to do what you need to do. The same thing with the experience or expertise. If somebody says, look, I know from doctors recommend it. Well, why should I believe that? Well, I may not know about a lot in terms of nutrition, but a doctor has specialized medical training where they've learned about anatomy and physiology, and they've spent years doing this in order to earn a degree that says that they know something about the human body even if I don't. And if I read something that says a doctor recommends it, they might be onto something even if I don't know it. And that's why citing expertise can be a powerful link in that warrant where to explain and justify the rationale. Or experience. Again, like we mentioned before, you said, well, it just feels more refreshing. Well, that's a feeling. That's subjective, right? Unless, based on experience, you know that when you've eaten an orange on a hot day, your brain has confirmed it and given you that wonderful sensation to remind you that this has got high water content, and that's what you need. They actually wrote a book in nutrition called Obey Your Body. You know, it's the idea that you, based on your realm of experiences, may actually have an intuitive sense of the things that you need. Let's move on. Backing. All right, so backing usually describes the core value in operation. So one that we use a lot in here is we talk about the bang for the buck. This is a cultural value that we have within the Army. It doesn't always need a lot of explanation. So in an argument like this, when I say, all right, you're kind of dehydrated, you've only got 2 fruits that you can choose from, which one's the better one? Most of you are probably thinking, well, I want the most bang for the buck. I want the highest nutritional and water content available for performance out of these 2. And you probably made a quick mental list that looks something like this. Everything I know about an orange, everything I know about a banana, which one stacks a little bit higher, and to tip the scale in that favor. We may have changed a few minds, but that's only because they took that mental scale, added a few, and re-rationalized around which one's going to be more beneficial on a day when you need it. So the backing is that assumed principle of value. It may not always be particularly obvious, but I'll give you some foresight here. In a few minutes, we're going to talk a little bit about cheerleading and whether or not it's a sport. Or we'll talk about Halo and whether they're actually, athletes. But you may have a certain series of assumptions about what is sport or sport-like in terms of what makes things competitive and worthwhile as a sport-like adventure. And you may have certain reservations about calling guys who play video games athletes, right? Well, all of those have these assumed pieces of knowledge. And just like we talked about before with those professional expectations in writing, there's going to be underwritten arguments in everything you write. When we talk about the bottom line up front, it's about decision making. When we talk about nutrition, it could be about what gives you the most value in the shortest amount of time that you have. So that's where the backing really becomes important, and sometimes you will have to unpack that. All right, and then one more. The refutation or the rebuttal. Again, like we mentioned before, this is when you just kind of make a quick assent to know that the other guy's out there. All right? You don't always have to undercut yourself, but it usually provides a solid counterpoint so people understand the decision-making process. Hardly ever will you see an argument that's completely one-sided, where everything is black and white. Just so you know, especially in CI work, there are going to be some areas where there's things that are absolutely black and white, right and wrong, but there are also a lot of places that are going to be better or worse. There's going to be some shades of wiggle room. And arguments are no different. You usually use a refutation where there's some wiggle room. I'm going to go back to another report. I know you haven't seen it yet, but there's a report out there called the Basic Source Data Report. And in it, you're going to talk about why a particular asset is highly motivated enough to be useful for intel gathering. And in there, you may have to give a little bit of the refutation. That guy's got high motivation. His family really needs the money, and this is something that we can exploit. But if he ever won the lottery, refutation, he might not be a good source of information anymore. If his rich uncle dies and he inherits it, we probably will lose our cooperation if money is his motivation. Right? That's where the refutation comes in handy. So you might have one like we talked about before. Oranges are preferable to bananas on a hot day. The refutation. If the potassium in the bananas might be useful to relieve dehydration-related problems. So over here, he was mentioning before the potassium content. If it's just about the water, then I probably want to stick with the orange. But if I've got cramping going on, I may need to go for the potassium anyway, just to relieve that symptom as well. There might be an exclusion or a reason to want to refute to say, like, okay, 9 times out of 10, I'm still voting the banana, but here's when you might need the orange. Or 9 times out of 10, here's the orange, but why might I vote for the banana? All right, make sense so far? All right, again, pretty basic stuff, but I wanted to highlight those techniques because when we start talking about making an argument, you've probably noticed that most people, most of the time, don't stick to this. When it comes to making arguments, most people eventually start with a claim, they'll move into some data, and then switch into calling you Hitler or something. So what we want to do is make sure that as professionals who are promoting Army-style writing and good documents for specific people in specific times for specific purposes, that we're holding on to these features when we need them. All right, if you move to the next one, just to break it out, here's what that completed diagram might look like if we were going to fill out each one of the elements that we've talked through. The example I used here was from that basic source data report. So you might find that a specific source will help to achieve strategic objectives because the source has unique access, ideal placement, and high motivation for helping. The warrant. This gives us a unique access opportunity to a particular target in the region, leading us to a conclusion. The source will be valuable for achieving mission objectives. And there are some reports where it may even go longer. And if you click again, the backing, well, the closer the source is to the target, the more valuable the information might be. Why would I want to interview Donald Trump's hairdresser when I can interview his chief of staff? All right? It's the underwritten rule of intelligence gathering that the closer the source is to the target. Again, like I was saying before, backing is usually one of those unwritten rules that we assume. Refutation, provided that the source's motivation holds up. All right, by show of hands, what I'd like to do is give you guys a chance to do a practice argument so we can identify some claims, data, and warrants with something simple. So by show of hands, how many of you, there are two topics that I think work really well for this, and both of which confound me. So last week I was watching ESPN2, and they were doing the National Cheerleading Championship. And I'd never seen this before in my life. But they get on afterwards, and they go up to the captain of the one cheerleading team, and they've got the microphone, and they said, hey, you know, you've just won the National Cheerleading Championship. You've led your team to victory. You know, what does it feel to be competing at this level, and you know, what does it mean for the sport? And she goes, I got to tell you, I'm really glad to be part of the sport of cheerleading. And I got to admit, I had a moment there where I was like, wait, cheerleading's a sport? When did that happen? All right. So that's topic one. I think that might be worth interesting to look at. The second topic that kind of amazed me was right after that. Again, I watch way too much ESPN2. I don't know why I'm apologizing to this section of the class. I just feel like I owe you an explanation. And on ESPN2, they had the National Halo Championship, which kind of surprised me because I didn't know what I was looking at first. It was a bunch of like, you know, groups of 4 like college-age, teenage-looking dudes wearing Mountain Dew T-shirts, clicking away on like an Xbox. Anyway, they interviewed that team captain, and he has the same thing. He gets up there and they go, you know, you've just won the National Halo Championship. Clearly, this is an amazing achievement for your team. It's been a long time coming. Again, what does it feel like to have won a competition at this level? And he goes, I got to correct you. We didn't play in this competition. We're athletes. He goes, to compete athletically at this level is extremely difficult. And I had to say, I don't think I've ever heard anybody besides a guy playing Halo call them athletes. So out of a quick show of hands here, is there one topic you'd like to tackle more? Like, you know, anyone have burning questions about the cheerleading thing? Halo playing? Oh, okay, that sounds like we got our winner. Here's what I'd like you to do. Break up with some people who are nearby, usually probably in the same row, and just discuss the issue for a second here. Are Halo players athletes? Create a claim, produce some kind of data for whichever claim you choose, identify your warrant so that you can explain it to us, and give some kind of backing, and then we're going to compare. Okay. All right. So it sounds like all the groups have at least produced one claim and some data and some warrants. For sake of time, I think we're fired up enough that we can keep moving forward. One thing that surprised me was internally how many groups had disagreement. So let's just start by this real quick. And this is more for my own edification than anything else. I wrote it up on the board. Okay, so are Halo players athletes was the question. Just by show of hands, how many people in the room, and it may not have been your whole team, so even if you disagreed heart and soul with everyone in your group, how many say yes, they're athletes? 1, 2, 3, 4, he's kind of on the fence, 4, 5. Did we have any other defenders over here? 5, just 5? Okay, we have 5 against the world. All right, what is the world? Okay, those of you said no. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. On the fence again, double voting. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. Okay, so 34 to 5. All right, assuming we got...
With 6 for Halo players. I'm jumping.
Oh, we already got one jumping over? Okay, I'm changing the number. All right, we may have to take some polls in the middle here. Having said that, though, because you came in at the last second here to switch over, the first thing I was going to ask was the yes team to issue a claim about why. So maybe you could start us off. Why did you suddenly at the last second switch and say, yes, I think they are Halo players because, or sorry, they're athletes because?
Well, I think they're athletes because I think it takes practice to constantly go up to that level of competition. You just don't show up at one of these events and jump in with these people. they go through levels just like any other sport.
Okay, so practice. You're going to say more than anything else. If you're going to be an athlete at any caliber, you're going to need some kind of practice.
Right.
For any of the other Halo defenders out there, on the specific issue of practice, does anyone know how much practice they put into being Halo players? It's more of a curiosity.
I'm not defending it, but on average, it's about 6 to 8 hours a day.
6 to 8 hours a day. Okay, so I'm going to add that as a data here. 6 to 8 hours. Okay, by comparison, Hugh Jackman, in getting ready for the role of Logan, was working out 3 to 4 hours a day. So we'll just keep that in mind in terms of athletic prowess. Hugh Jackman, you know, shredded. Halo guy, not so shredded, but practice. So I'm just throwing that out there. Sorry, I gave a refutation. All right, for anyone else who said yes, do we have any other claims as to why? All right, so they practice. What else do they do that makes them athletes for those of you who are in the yes column?
They compete.
Okay, they compete. All right. So we already have some refutation coming from the other side of the room. Maybe you can unpack so that they'll know what they're getting into. When you say that they compete, can you unpack that competition for us?
Well, they compete on different levels within their event. So you do the same thing when you're playing sport.
Okay, so I think I got this here. As opposed to our cheerleaders, where it's one group of cheerleaders come out, they do their thing, then they leave the field. Halo players are in direct competition with one another. And just like a football player or a soccer player, they meet on the field of battle, right? In a direct head-to-head version. So this is not like your ballet class or your speech and debate, right? This is going to be one-on-one in an arena of some sort. Fair? Okay, competition. And I'm going to put arena style. I mean, they're just the electronic gladiators of the 21st century, man. Sorry, that's my point, not yours. All right, other claims, why they are athletes. And I can even open this up, even if you didn't defend and say yes, if you know of another. Okay, over here.
So it requires talent.
Requires talent. Can you unpack talent for us?
So, no, I'm not switching sides. I'm just,
This is
there is, you can't just kind of, for most of the games anyway, you have to naturally get a feel for a game before, like, you can just start playing a game and there's no way you're going to be anywhere near able to compete on a professional level. So it requires that sort of baseline talent that you can enhance on.
Okay, can you give us a comparison example from another sport so we can tease that out as a piece of data? Oh, I saw a hand shoot up here to defend that.
So like Allen Iverson, he ain't practiced, but he was talented.
He was.
And what sport does he play, just for the record? Basketball, okay. All right, so we might say, and again, I'm just unpacking the talent for data here, we might say that some athletes in some events may have a natural gift for it. So in basketball, running faster, jumping higher. In Halo, quicker reflexes or hand-eye. Okay, I'm just going to write hand-eye. Hand-eye, speed. Out of curiosity, does anyone here know the average age of a Halo champion?
12.
No, I'm asking. Does anyone know? Everyone looks at me like I know. I don't know this. What do I look like? No. Okay, so I got another hand over here. Claim data or warrant?
Yes. They could actually make a living doing it. They get
Okay.
paid to do it, just like any other athlete. They get sponsorships and they make a ton of money.
I played soccer when I was a kid.
Okay, so I'm going to unpack that in two places. So the answer here was yes, they're athletes because you can make a living doing it. In other words, there's enough people watching the event that they can gain sponsors and an income. And if we can make a living, so I'm just going to put money down here because we don't know how much they live off of, but we know that at that level, they can probably live off it pretty comfortably for a year, especially if all they drink is Mountain Dew. All right. Sorry, I shouldn't mock these guys, but maybe a little. All right. Anyway, any other claims for why they're athletes? Over here.
Okay, I'm emphatically on the no side, but there are terms that exist like mental exercise and mental athletics. So, I mean, there is that.
Okay, and can you unpack mental exercise and mental athletics? So are there any other sports you can think of where we'd say the people are athletes where they use one of those skills?
Well, I mean, I would say any legitimate, real athletic sport, undoubtedly has a mental component to it. I mean, it doesn't matter, how, on paper dumb somebody might be. If they're a, competitive athlete, they have a certain, mental strength that they can apply to that sport.
Okay, so I'm going to put this down in two ways. You said mental strength and we talked about mental activities. So I'm going to say right now, focus, which is what you were saying before. So maybe there's this, like in other athletic events, you have to be intensely engaged in the game. And in the same way that a tennis player might be concentrating on the ball coming over and where it's going to head and the dynamics of motion, they're doing the same thing, but in the pixelated version where their characters running on the screen and there's fictional bullets flying, but they're focused on it to get a sense of spatial awareness. I would also maybe add, actually, does somebody else want to add one in here? Is there something unique to Halo playing that maybe I'm missing that might defend this other focus argument?
Strategy?
Yeah, I was going to say strategy. The one I was thinking was tactics and strategy. One thing that surprised me watching these guys was if married couples talked as much as they did, there would be no divorce in America. And they're constantly in this communication, figuring out what their battle plan and strategy is going to be. And then there's also this part where, because of the practice, there's a weird rhythm to it. And it's funny because I watch a lot of MMA, but I don't watch a lot of Halo. But the announcers are the exact same way. Like, it was the version of, he's got him in the Halo version of a Kimura. You're like, he didn't actually say it that way, but that was what my mind was projecting. Like, there's these pre-focused strategy and tactics that they use. And I would swear that these guys probably read, like, small arms fire manuals or something to get a better idea of it. They're deeply invested in their sport, if I can call it that. All right, let's move over. For those of you who said, hell no, absolutely not. Whoa, I didn't even finish the question. I got hands in the air. I'm just going to work from front to back on this one because I didn't see any of these hands go up or in what order. So right over here, we haven't heard from you yet.
All right. Everybody's skipping around just the definition of athlete and just putting up reasons as to why they would be good at it.
Okay.
I might be a terrible athlete, but the point of an athlete is a person who is trained or skilled in exercises, sports, or games requiring physical strength, agility, or stamina. Just because somebody's focused, just because somebody's that's not the point. All those things up there are like, oh, they make money for it. That just makes them a professional. That doesn't make them an athlete.
Okay. So if I'm getting you right, you're saying the key phrase out of this, I think that you're gravitating towards the physicality of it. So if I'm going to be Michael Phelps in the pool, I'm probably going to have to develop a certain set of muscles that are different from our Halo player athlete. So in terms of athleticism, like if we're going to look for data here, what muscles of the body and or physiology are the Halo player guys engaging? All right, that's what I saw too. In fact, I'm not going to single anyone out here, but I actually saw some people demonstrating this in their groups. They're like, man, all you got to do to be a Halo player is this. And they like slumped over. It was kind of cool. But in seeing that, I think we get the idea here that the physicality is all focused either here and then maybe between here and here, like the hand-eye coordination. So I'm going to put data. Halo uses hands only. Hands, eyes only. So this is a very narrow realm of the body to work with to be an athlete. In the back.
So we, again, we looked up the definition of athlete, and it derives from the Greek word athlein, which means to compete for a prize. And you would think with the Greeks it would be a physical activity, and you bring it to today, and yes, like they were saying, Halo, they do compete for a prize, but really I think it's more of a society's definition of an athlete.
Interesting.
So nowadays when you hear athletes, you're like football, basketball, baseball, all that. So I think that has something to do with it as well. Society's take on it.
I think that's a good point to make of it. You're like, okay, so again, for those of you who maybe didn't hear it, he said, look, if we look at the definition of the word athlete and we look at it historically, these are people who compete for a prize. But in the ancient world, their only prize was glory, right? Exactly. They're not always necessarily showered with the gold, although maybe sometimes, but maybe there's a prestige about it. So if I'm hearing you right, what I think you're saying here is, yes, they may compete, yes, they may even get paid, but is their prestige level of this competition revered to the same degree as other sports, we would say? And I think that's good data over here. I see a lot of hands going up here. Like, was this about the reverence for the sport?
I was going to say something about the glory thing. So I don't do Halo, but I compete in a game of war. I'm Lord Killam in Game of War. And there's a lot of freaking prestige in that. Right? You try to burn me. But anyway.
Amongst the players.
Okay, compared to other sports. So I think that we're making a fair data set here. If we were going to compare we do a national survey in the United States and see how many people watch football. We'd probably find that the number of people watch football, American football, I should say, I guess, on a world stage, because I want to be fair to the games because they sometimes take place outside of the U.S. and how much money is involved and how much prestige, we probably would find there's a disparity. Just like we did in here. We just took a casual vote in this room, and we found out it was 34-6 of people who said no, and I bet prestige was a part of that decision. Some of you haven't heard from yet. In the back, and then here.
Okay, so develop the physical exercise. The definition is any bodily activity that enhances or maintains physical fitness and overall health and wellness. Halo does not do that.
All right, so health and wellness. All right, if we were looking for data behind that, what kind of experiential expertise or what kind of data would we use to support that enhancing the wellness? Because that sounds like a pretty good claim. Oh, sorry, and then we'll come over here.
Watch a single E-League match. None of them look like they're in shape. None of them.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, they talk about it in. I only know this because one of my close friends from college worked on an E-League as a promotion.
Whoa.
We'll get to that later. So there's a documentary that he worked on for promotion purposes, and they actually had to encourage these kids to stay active and be physically active so that they can maintain their health. It was like this weird ESPN thing that they did to combine physical athleticism with the games.
Okay. So if we combine these two ideas, I think we take that. We're saying, look, if it's about enhancing wellness and overall physicality, then we might have to find some kind of measure for that. And it sounds like you've got it over here. If we're talking about, and I'm going to paraphrase, but aerobic and anaerobic strength, if they've got to convince guys who are already playing Halo to do something extra to meet that, then maybe it doesn't quite qualify. And then you've been waiting for a while. So what was the claim?
I think in any real sport that I can think of, there's a reasonable risk of injury.
Broken thumbs.
Risk of injury. All right.
Not like, Mom, I need you to bring me my crack of rib.
Okay. So let's address this. Same question. Now, I took a quick second to write this over here because I think we've been hovering around it for a little while. But obviously, when we started talking about athletes and athleticism in sports, a lot of people went right to a definition and they started looking things up because I think this is what we're going for here. The backing we're searching for is what does it mean to be a real sport? And I'm glad the way you phrase it kind of really gets to the guts of it. That this is really what we're talking about in terms of our dividing line, is what makes a sport more sport-like than something else. And in doing so makes these guys more athletic. But let's make sure to close the loop on this claim here. One is the risk of injury. We're saying in other sports, especially the ones that most of us would agree are sport-like. We don't have time to put it to a vote right now, but let me just pick one. Show of hands, how many of you would say, if I think of Halo versus football, I'm going to say football definitely a sport. Okay, so we'll just use football for now. If we were going to close the data here and say no, they're not, what's the highest risk of injury I could expect as a Halo player as opposed to like a football player?
Sprained wrist.
Okay, brain aneurysm.
Medical point of view.
Yeah, some people would say risk of seizure.
Yeah, it's like carpal tunnel.
Carpal. Yep. Well, what we would do then is, if we were still going back, I would also then list out the risk of injury for something like football, which we know would be like concussion, broken bone, broken leg. Thank you. Yeah, death. Good point. I'll admit, you've got me on that one. I didn't think of that. All right, so we were saying, okay, because there's a low risk of injury, and that the worst we could say over here might be something like a brain aneurysm, seizure, or carpal tunnel, we probably wouldn't say it. All right, so while we're on this, did we have anybody who was right in the middle? And by that I just mean anybody who said, you know, maybe they're a sport if, or maybe they'd be a sport, but, over here?
I don't think it's that. So like the definition of sport has always changed over time based on what society sees a sport as.
Mm-hmm.
And like not too long ago, snowboarding wasn't a sport. But now you have it in the X Games and there's all these leagues for it and stuff. So, I mean, it's and with the way our society is changing and you see all these little ankle biters coming up, that eventually this will be a sport and they will call this a sport and everybody's going to have to get out of their box. But as of right now, it's not a sport.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you right, we would say this is a no but category, and that's why it'd be on the fence. We're like, no, I don't think it's a sport because of these things. But if the definition changed, and that's why I put that over here down by reputation. This seems like a rebuttal that sports have changed historically. Right now, chess is in the Olympics, and for a while, wrestling almost wasn't. So there's this thing where people are revising these definitions all the time. A lot of hands. Actually, we haven't heard from you in a while, and then I'm going to go over here to the middle again.
So all of the data points, the claims under yes, could support the argument that competitive Halo playing is a sport, but that's not the argument. The argument is whether or not people who play Halo are athletes.
Okay.
And I don't think all the things under yes support the athletic claim. They do support the sport claim. They don't necessarily support the athletic claim.
Okay.
The key term with athlete was overall health. And football isn't going to give you like obesity or coronary artery disease.
Oh, I hear some refutations going. Before I write anything, do we have somebody who directly wants to address that one point?
I will argue it.
Okay, over here.
Offensive linemen, as soon as they're done, or actually even, there's been cases of offensive linemen dying of heart failure because they're so big. Like legit cases. Yeah, he's still.
Okay, and then over here.
Just because you're in shape and you're doing a lot of good stuff and everything doesn't mean not at risk for heart. Case in point, me, I thought I was in really good shape. Actually, I wasn't in really good shape. I had 2 strokes. Sometimes it's just freaking genetics.
That's true.
Okay, so here's, I think, what you're driving at here. If I was going to label this under the warrant category, it's just really what we're driving to. When you made the claim, you're like, look, I think what they're defending here is a sport, but it's not necessarily athleticism. We're driving into the warrant territory. We're trying to justify why this data may or may not prove the claim. And what I'm getting out of this right now is this. In terms of the risk factors that we've identified in data, there's incidental risk and then directly causal risk. So causal risk is like, because I'm charging at a guy full speed with a helmet on and he's charging at me and we're thunking heads, we have a direct causal relationship between our collision and my concussion. Whereas incidental risk might be because I was playing Halo and I didn't notice a leaky roof and it fell on me. It may be an unintended danger and consequence. Or better, when the best, and now seriously, the best cause of incidental risk I've ever heard about with Halo playing was that Mountain Dew joke. That because they're pounding down energy drinks, that they're actually long-term risking their health from a heart disease standpoint as much as a traditional athlete would in terms of like knee, body, and concussion injuries. So anyway, interesting thought there. But I think that's where we go with the warrant here is, more or less the to what degree. How do I paraphrase this? What we're really asking about here is we would trust this if risk is a factor. And it's causal. Now over here, I think we would say like risk is a factor, but incidental. But I'm not going to write that down because I saw so many hands going up while I was talking. Over here?
Are we going into warrants now?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to completely ruin my reputation in this whole class, and I really don't care. So
thank you for the qualifier.
From my personal experience, I was actually on the amateur level of both sides. I used to be an amateur Battlefield and Call of Duty player, and I used to be an amateur mixed martial arts fighter.
Okay.
There is no way I would even remotely compare my experience as a mixed martial arts fighter to playing video games. I will admit, and I will concede that it requires talent and practice and strategy and all that, but I broke a rib, I've gotten concussions, I spent days and hours in the gym training, practicing, and even going to fights. I spent so much more time in my fighting career than I did in my gaming career, which wouldn't even call it a career. I only made like a couple $1,000s off of it. There's no way it is even in remote comparison from my personal experience.
Okay, so let's summarize that as a warrant. I think you've got some good justification here. You're like, if we took this same data and compared it from both sides, you're saying, and I'm just going to paraphrase again to make sure I got it clear. You're like, if I take the head-to-head competitiveness I had in MMA against the head-to-head competitiveness I had in Halo, the level of risk and amount of bodily damage and training and physicality I had to do was so much greater than that which I had to do for Halo. There were no do-overs or second lives in MMA. I get punched in the face, I really get punched in the face. Over here I get clubbed in the face, I get a do-over, right? If I'm hearing you right. So the risk factor is what really hovers over this. And it sounds like it's connected to this underwritten claim. No danger, no athleticism. Like in terms of what we're talking about here for the sport direct competition. Over here?
Yeah, I was just on the warrant. If you are saying that Halo players who do no physical activity but compete are athletes, you also have to say that salesman is an athlete because they have competitions.
Mm-hmm.
They win a lot of money if they win.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to, there's this whole opening of things that you have to include as an athlete.
Yeah. So I think I see what you're saying over here is the warrant too. Again, this would be actually over here, but using this data set, you're like, if I practice being a salesman, I compete at being a salesman, it does require talent that may be intuitive and otherwise undefinable. I can make a living at it, and it's still a mental competition as well, or it has a mental dimension. Then how come a salesman isn't an athlete either? And you're saying to say that there would be an athlete would be to diminish this risk factor, and to say that somehow the risk is meaningless, when we would say when it's connected to the data and the wellness. All right, I need to get one rebuttal over here for the warrant here. Is there somebody who would still say on the yes side that there's a reason we would still defend this as athletic? And don't worry about the risk factors just yet, but based on this data set and evidence, what's the underwriting assumption here that we're using to justify this? Over here.
Just how they could use the definition, so can we. Like a person who's trained or skilled in exercises, sports, nobody agrees it's a sport, but it does say or games. It definitely is a game, requiring physical strength, agility, or stamina. It definitely requires stamina. There's a reason those guys are sitting there drinking energy drinks to stay up to play this game. It requires stamina.
When they say stamina, I think they mean muscular or cardiovascular endurance. Sitting
Well,
in the same place for 12 hours, I don't think qualifies as endurance.
Right. But this is interesting. Now, this is cool though, because this is exactly what we mean by the warrant. This is,
Stamina could mean just being able to stay awake.
okay.
You know, to have
So if you just
stamina.
lay on the football field and stay awake.
Yeah. Well, hold on. Well, it's funny though, because he may have a point here too. If we include the whole football team, there are some people who never get off the bench, and we would still call them athletes, no risk on the field. But let's go back to this. This is the warrant territory, and I really was glad that you guys brought this up here. You're like, here's what I think it means when we talk about being an athlete, versus here's what I think it says when it talks about being an athlete. If we go by a definition of athleticism that's broad enough where it includes any physicality, then over on this side, to defend our Halo players, we would also include any one of these sports that otherwise doesn't have as much physicality to it. You can get a gold medal in chess. It's a real thing. And again, because their argument is that you're using this part of the body instead of this part of the body. So this is where we're really having that dividing line. Now, I'd like to turn our attention over here to the backing and the refutation, because this is really where we get into the meat of it. When we talk about a backing, we're usually talking about some kind of cultural value that has hitherto been hidden. So I'd like to just kind of get a vote here. I'd like to do one sport at a time and then place it on this spectrum. Absolute yes, absolute no, not absolutely sure, and figure out where we really think sports are. So by show of hands, how many of you would say football? Absolute yes?
Absolutely.
Okay. Basketball?
Yeah.
B-ball? The other B-ball, baseball?
Yeah.
Oop, I'm hearing some hesitation, so I'm moving it a little bit here. Baseball. All right, over here. Tennis.
Yes.
Over here. World soccer, not just American football. Or sorry, world soccer. Yes. Soccer. Bowling. Whoa. Okay, bowling.
It is, but yeah.
All right, now that we're in the comfortable gray, golf. Yeah. All right, by verbal vote here, I'm putting golf more towards the center. All right, let's see if I can find one over here. Cheerleading. Yeah, nobody wants to say no to the cheerleading now. Okay. All right, so let me get one from the field here. Anything else besides Halo that you would say is absolutely not a sport that people otherwise meet some of these definitions for?
Competitive food eating.
All right, I heard the only one I heard clearly was chess. Poker.
Competitive food eating is a sport.
What else?
Fantasy football.
Fantasy football.
Chess is a sport. It's in the Olympics.
Okay, this is a funny point though about the fantasy football. So it's like if you're having a fantasy about that football, it ain't really a sport. Going over to the cheerleading, every time I've done this, somebody goes, man, cheerleading is a sport. Cheerleading is what you do when a sport is happening. Like, fantasy football isn't a sport. Fantasy football is what you do when you're watching the real sport. So somebody always gets there. Any other absolute no's? NASCAR. Somebody says, oh, debatable. Okay. Now that I've mapped it out, though, I think here's what you guys will probably see. When we talk about sports and athleticism in the United States, we're also jumbling together a couple of values that fall under the backing. And you'll notice how our usual contenders, the same ones who said no over here, are going to involve direct one-on-one competition with a quantifiable score. And, this is one of the criteria in the football, right? You know the ball either passed over the line or didn't pass over the line. Yes, maybe you had a ref who's got to make a judgment call about whether or not his knee was on the line, but there's always a quantifiable measure. Over here, we may have a quantifiable measure, but then it's missing something. Usually this sense of direct competition and risk. Notice all of these are headbutting sports or direct physicality sports. They involve running, jumping, dribbling, some kind of physical element. I'd also argue that when we put something like cheerleading out there, the yes was for the physicality, but not necessarily for the scoring. Am I right? Yeah. Yeah. Over on the same side, well, actually, let me find this one out here. Where would you guys put figure skating?
In the middle.
If cheerleading is a sport,
Okay. But we have disagreement.
I would say more than golf.
I'd say other side.
Okay. The point is debatable and in the middle. This was one where the room is somewhat divided. They're like, I kind of put it on the side, maybe yes, maybe no. And I bet it's because of this. When we're talking about soccer, ball goes through net. When we're talking about cheerleading, you hit your mark. You either made your triple flip or you didn't, which is objective. But you also have the subjective. Right? There's some level of, I thought you looked really cheerful while you did it. Right? Same thing I think happens over here with figure skating. My reaction that I heard over here the reaction I heard over here that I think really mattered was like, well, look at the risk involved. Look at the athleticism. But over here, I think people are a little more on the fence because of that same subjectiveness. Like, yeah, I appreciate they can hit their triple sow cow, but if they're sitting there smiling at the end with the, I don't care, Yes. So this is the thing that we're really driving into. I think what we would say again is, it's this risk of injury and physicality is the unwritten rule. To be a real sport, you have to have objective criteria and headbutting. There has to be a real field of battle of gladiatorial combat in which you know that there's a clear winner and a loser, and you have to actually risk yourself while doing it, which is why we would say the only reason under which we would probably say that Halo players are athletes is if they could compete in a virtual environment where if they got shot, they bleed. Like I heard somebody over here mentioning the virtual reality.
Somebody slaps him in the face. It's like
Yeah, there's actually like a haptic biofeedback component to where if they get shot, they get like an electric jolt. Yeah. All right. Hey, good to know. If we ever get into, and at that point, they'd have to call it like extreme Halo. Your hand's been up for a while. What were you going to add on?
Like you were saying a second ago, so with cheerleading, it's a panel of judges that, through their own opinions, they grade it. Whereas every other, and that's why they say it's a cheerleading competition.
Mm-hmm.
So, and like you said, everything else, like football, you either scored or you didn't. You have judges, but it's a set thing. Like, yeah, he made it across the line. He did. Cheerleading, they're gonna, oh, he did that better than the other person did.
Yeah.
That's why I think that one gets a higher score for that. But it was the judge's opinion. So NASCAR.
Yep.
He either got all the laps faster than everybody else or he didn't. Then there's no like, oh, well, he drove quicker for that little bit, so that looked better and all that stuff. So,
Yeah. So if I'm getting you right, what you're mentioning here.
One's a competition, one's a sport.
Yeah. So you would say over here with NASCAR, you have objective scoring, risk of physical danger, and athleticism, right? But maybe not to the same degree as here. So you would object to that and say, like, I think we need to move it forward.
I don't even think athleticism needs to be required in sport.
Oh, okay. All right. So the response there was not even sure that athleticism needs to be required in a sport. And I think that's what we're kind of putting down here by the refutations on one side or the other. So far, we've only covered the no. That to be a sport, if they added some kind of physical feedback and a physical dimension to Halo, then I'll call these guys athletes. This would be the reverse. No, I don't think they need to. And anything that we call a sport because of the competition to it, regardless of the athleticism, could count, if I'm hearing you right. Okay. All right, so we're running a little bit over, we're running a lot over time. In any case, I appreciate the spirit of discussion. Here's what I was hoping to get out of this that we want to tie together. You may not always be talking about whether or not Halo is a sport. You may be having different arguments like, is this guy a terrorist, right? but it's the same process. You're going to start with some kind of definition and objective value and come up with a claim. And you're going to need some kind of quantifiable data to support that while you rationalize your decision out there. And just like in here, you may have times where there's absolutely a right answer and absolutely a wrong answer, and times like this where you have a little bit more of the blurry. The key is that you use these different features to break it out to understand what it is you're really arguing about, so that you can identify what's going to be useful for the argument. And that way, if people say, is there an exception to the rule? You know, yes, I'm giving a refutation. Or if they say, you know, how do we know what a terrorist is and in what context? You know that you're really dealing with this side of the warrants about the level of danger they may pose or the risk they cause to somebody at random. Does that make sense, though, about the different parts of the argument and how they all kind of spin together? Again, I appreciate it. Even in this organic conversation, we did kind of the same thing. I asked you about claims, but I didn't have to ask much for data. Then eventually the conversation progressed to the warrant. Why do you really believe this? How does this actually make your case? And then after a while, once we looked and teased out that back end, we found out that there's some trends here, underwritten assumptions about what we think about sport and athleticism that informed our opinion, that helped us dissect it. You know, again, if real sport is gladiatorial combat in the modern arena, that's a little bit like saying and identifying we need the bang for the buck in a military context. We have to understand what these motivations are in order to make proper refutations. All right, so that's about all that we got time for today. To again tie it together, some of the reports you write are going to ask for your agent's comments, and that will really take this kind of shape, a 5-sentence answer where you distill all of the argument that you might make about a source, about you know, a different event, or you know, synthesize all of the individual pieces of data that you've pulled together and have to tie it together somehow. You may have tons and tons of this by the time that you're done. I mean, data is the easy part. Who was there, when they were there, what happened, what was really important about that. And then you may have to really tease out the claim for somebody to explain it, and this is how. Right? Any questions about this before we move on? And hopefully not a question like, you know, when's the next Halo tournament? Questions about claims, data, warrants, backings, refutation? Okay. While you guys were talking, we passed out a handout. If you do have questions about it, there's an example on the handout where we took a PIR and broke it down to look at the different elements. And it's a pretty well-written one, where you can see how the guy made his initial claim, broke it down into the different sections of data, and then defended it with a very short warrant. That's pretty representative of the kind of writing you'll see in this context, where somebody will introduce a claim, have tons of evidence behind it, and then just spend a little bit of time teasing it out. We didn't get a chance to cover it right now, but I think this was a useful illustration to kind of get you motivated and getting into the formation of the argument. In any case, it's been my absolute pleasure to work with you guys today. I had a lot of fun. I think you guys did too, I hope. It's not a bad way to end the Tuesday. And in any case, if you have any further questions about how this will apply to your reports, sit tight, because when you're learning about each individual report, you're going to cover a little bit of this each time. And if you would like to know anything more about what we do with the USAICoEWriting program, feel free to reach out to me. And I'll have my contact information available afterwards. Otherwise, unless there are any announcements or anything else, okay, so I'll turn it over to the... Okay, then I'm all finished, and again, it's been my absolute pleasure. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you had fun.